Welcome to the fifth and last AGU-sponsored Carl Sagan webinar and discussion series. My name is Dennis Ojima. I'm a senior research scientist at Colorado State University. This discussion series has been organized to delve into more depth in the career path of this year's Sagan lecturer, who will be Compton James Tucker III. We have conducted webinars on the Sagan legacy and the emergence of remote sensing capabilities, contributions to the carbon cycle, the advancement of land cover change related to Earth system sciences. Today, we will hear from Professor Michele Betsill of the Political Science Department at Colorado State University on issues related to global environmental governance and the role of Earth system observations. Before we hear from Michele, let me provide a short bio sketch of Professor Betzel. Michele is a professor in political science at Colorado State University and former chair of that department. She's a leading scholar of global environmental governance. She received her Bachelor's of Arts at DePaul University in 1989 and went on to earn 2 additional master's degrees, one in international studies in 1991 from University of Denver, and a second in political sciences in 1997 from CU Boulder, where she continued her work in political sciences where she received her PhD in 2000. She has worked as a transboundary researcher throughout her career between the complex systems of the climate world and an even more complex arena of governance, working at institutions like the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Boulder and the John F. Kennedy School of Governance at Harvard University. Her research on non-state and sub-national actors has expanded knowledge of who participates in setting and implementing rules to address climate change from the global to local levels and across the public and private spheres. Her work highlights the importance of governance and mechanisms the importance of governance mechanisms beyond multilateral treaties and national policies and moving towards a low carbon future. She is a founding member of the Earth System Governance Project, the world's largest network of scholars working on at the intersection of governance and global environmental change. With that, I'll turn over the discussion to Michele.
Thanks, Dennis. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar series. I had fully intended to attend some of the previous ones, and life took over, as it has for many of us. But I'm happy to be here today. So I've been tasked with talking about global environmental policy, and in particular the role of Earth system observations in developing responses to global environmental problems. I have just a few opening comments, and then I told Dennis he could sort of steer me in whatever direction he wanted to along the way. So I want to talk about a couple of things. First, how the international community is organized to try to develop responses to global environmental change, global environmental problems, and in particular, how is organized to take up Earth system observations or system science into that process. And then I'll also talk about some general issues about the relationship between science and policy, or science and governance. Just a quick clarification of how I'm using terms. I froze. Okay. In the social sciences, policy often has a very specific meaning and refers to formal laws and regulations that governments develop. And we tend to use this term governance to cover the broader range of both formal and informal rules and regulations, organizations, and decision-making processes that are used to try to address global environmental problems. So we're interested not just in what governments are doing, but also other actors, as Dennis mentioned in my intro, non-governmental organizations, corporations, social movements, local governments, as well as national governments, and not just looking at formal laws and regulations, but also things like corporate social responsibility, certification and standards programs. So it's a really broad basket, and that will become important here in a minute. So I'm thinking about how the international community has addressed global environmental policy. So here I'm very much talking about how national governments have tried to coordinate their efforts to deal with global environmental change. Since the 1970s, those efforts have really been organized within the United Nations system. And a focus on setting up intergovernmental organizations like the UN Environment Program, and even more so negotiating multilateral environmental agreements. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the subsequent Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement that constitute what we call the climate change regime. There's international treaties on biodiversity, ocean conservation, et cetera. And as part of these processes, often sort of in parallel with these processes, and as many of you probably know, countries have also set up international organizations whose task, or at least part of their mandate, is to help sort of provide scientific information or scientific input into these decision-making and these treaty processes. And so here we can think about the World Meteorological Organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And these have sort of served as boundary organizations, right? And have been really important in sort of providing a mechanism to raise awareness about the global scale of environmental issues, their severity, and sort of how they're manifesting. So we can think about observations about the ozone hole in the 1980s, understanding of levels of deforestation in the Amazon, global precipitation patterns in the climate arena. So these organizations have been really important in helping to sort of provide a pathway for that sort of information to enter into the decision-making processes. Today, there's a number of concerns about this organizational system, whether it's really up to the task. And so, some of these organizations that have been set up to sit at this sort of science policy boundary, there's questions about whether they provide sufficient levels of synthesis and do it in a way that's useful for decision makers. So there's a long-standing discussion about the sort of timing of IPCC reports, for example, and not necessarily coinciding with the decision-making processes. And so information doesn't always come in at the exact times when decision makers might need it. So there's questions about that. To date, our system for developing global environmental policy has been very fragmented. And so we have the climate regime over here, we have the biodiversity regime over here, we have the ocean system over here. But increasingly, and in part because of our system science, we recognize that these are interrelated planetary processes. And so, figuring out how to both address those interactions from a policy standpoint, but also provide sufficient input from the scientific community about the interactions between those systems is challenging. Our existing organizations, particularly the decision-making organizations, are not necessarily set up to incorporate new information, to make adjustments to deal with nonlinearities. They're pretty slow. If you've followed any of the UN negotiations, you know that there can be hours of debates over a semicolon, right? These are not fast-moving institutions. And so there's debates about, do we need new decision-making institutions? Do we need new scientific institutions? Can we reform our existing institutions? How can we sort of maybe rethink this organizational structure that we have for facilitating this coordination between countries? Because that's clearly part of, what is needed to address global environmental issues. But making it even more complicated, since the 1990s, there's really been this shift or expansion of where global environmental governance takes place. And so it's not just in the halls of the UN, it's in corporate boardrooms, it's in City Hall, it's through transnational social movements, people that are connecting, through social media, through Facebook. And so increasingly we have a more diverse set of users, potentially abusers of scientific information, different understandings of the problem. So even though local governments tend to think about the issue of climate change in a way that is distinct from how it's thought about at the global level, for example. And so there's different types of data needs. They need to be more scale appropriate. And we don't really have formal organizational structures in place to provide scientific information across all of these different arenas and to all these different actors and at all these different scales. And so that's something that we can certainly discuss. I also wanted to talk about more generally about the relationship between what we often call the science policy interface, but again, I would call it sort of the science governance interface. And here I think it's really important, and again, I think those of you who have worked in this boundary know this very well. And here I'm going to use policy in a generic sense, but governance. The world of science and the world of policy or governance are really different worlds. And so if you were to create like a travel guide, right, they would have different sorts of customs, they would have different languages, they would have different norms. So in science, in science world, you operate under facts, logic, testing, peer review. In the policy or the governance world, it's often a world where facts and values sort of interact with one another. It's a world where people express passion, engage in persuasion. Issues intersect with one another in often really messy ways. There's power dynamics, and so we always have to think about winners and losers, right, of different decisions that are being made. So policy and governance involve political judgments, practical considerations, and so science is not the only factor, only input that goes into decision making. And in fact, scientific information doesn't just speak for itself. And it's important to remember that just because we have a scientific understanding of what might be going on, that doesn't automatically lead to agreement on what should be done about it, how things should be done. And what we do know, this has not been my primary area of research, but certainly a lot of people that work in my field have looked at what makes for this effective interface. And science needs to be, we need institutional mechanisms to assure decision makers not only that the science is credible, that it's right, that it's it's good, it's accurate, but that also it's been produced in a legitimate way. And it's almost often as important about who's producing it, who's involved in producing it. So if you've been around for a while and following the IPCC in its first iteration, developing countries were reluctant to accept some of the findings because there hadn't been many developing country scientists involved in the process. And today there's questions about relying solely on peer-reviewed literature, and people say, well, there's other types of knowledges that we should be taking into consideration. So this question of the legitimacy of the information and the salience, that it has to be addressing things that are on policymakers, on decision makers' minds, to sort of make this interface work. And probably most importantly is to remember that there are people involved in this relationship, working across science and governance, and that trust becomes really important. And so those individual relationships, those trust relationships, are important in operating at that boundary. I think it's also important to recognize that governance is a process, and it moves through different stages. And as it moves through different stages, we might think about the role of scientific input in different ways. So we start with agenda setting, raising awareness that there are problems in the world, they're identified, they're defined, and then there's a process of prioritizing. And so, science absolutely plays an important role and has historically. Again, if we look back at the ozone hole, the observations of the ozone hole absolutely sort of prompted the international community to react. But agenda setting is also highly political. It's an act of deciding what problems should be addressed and what problems shouldn't be addressed, making choices over what we address. And there's questions over whether science or scientists should play a primary role here. And from a sort of democratic perspective, you should have more voices. You have people whose lives will be affected by the choices that are going to be made, weighing in on those decisions as well. And of course, just defining a problem is an act of power. Next becomes the choice of, okay, so we've identified a problem, we know we want to do something about it, how do we decide what to do? And so again, I always say to my students, even if everybody agreed 100% on the scientific facts of climate change, we still would fight like heck to figure out what to do about it, because some people feel very strongly that we should have strong government regulations. Other people feel very strongly that the government should stay out of the way and we should rely on market forces. And so there's a whole set of politics involved in deciding how we should address issues, what sorts of mechanisms we should look at. And there's a variety of factors that go into those choices. It's not just sort of costs and benefits. It's questions about who's winning and who's losing. It turns out that people who have vested interests in the way the system is today are going to fight pretty hard to keep that system in place. We see that with the politics of coal in this country, for example. And so here, there's different types of scientific questions that we want to ask. And so, the scientific information that can help choose and make those choices amongst those different policy instruments become really important. Then we have the implementation, putting those into place, and that's largely in the hands of those who have recognized authority to put rules into place. And then finally, we have monitoring and evaluation. And again, here's where we see a very central role for science and scientific observations. Are we actually making progress in solving the problems that we want to address using these policy instruments? So just really recognizing the ways that it's not sort of a monolithic relationship, that science policy relationship. It's dynamic, it's relational, and it involves a lot of work and exchange. So I think I will stop there and let Dennis see where we want to go next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. That's a wonderful overview. I see that, I don't know if Jim, if you want to join the conversation as well. I see that you're online, but it seems to me that the way you describe the policymaking side of things, especially understanding that it's not just the facts that come into play, there's other values and other considerations that go into policymaking, that where on the global environmental scene, where effective policy changes, and there's an example today that was aired earlier about how the demonstration of the ozone hole disappearance over Antarctica was very influential in gathering sort of a more political understanding of how rapidly things were changing with the ozone, and then the implications of that. And so having a visual observation of these type of changes can be very effective. Compton Tucker's work with looking at the Earth metabolism with the NDVI and the looking at the carbon cycle, I think has also been influenced. How do you see us moving forward and communicating more effectively with the policy community, with trying to gather up enough visual information that would, better communicate the rich data that we have?
You could probably answer this question as well as I can, because I'm certainly not a science communication expert. But I think having visuals is really important. People, if you can sort of, it's simplifying the messaging, making something clear. It's about storytelling, right? This is what the sort of science communicators always take. So what is the story? And again, if we go back to the ozone hole, there was a sort of very clear story. I think the important thing to note about that case is it wasn't sort of we saw the ozone hole and policymakers all said, yes, we're just going to go up and get rid of ozone depleting substances. In that case, again, if we looked at winners and losers, there was a really important case that the companies who were producing those substances had an easy sort of alternative, which, as it turns out, wasn't great for climate. But it certainly it moved the process along, and so I think that having these images. But I think that one of the challenges, I as someone who has spent a lot of time working, particularly in the climate world, and seeing the scientific images of precipitation patterns of NDVI. I remember early on in my career, I was sitting in a seminar, and there was just sort of, and this was the day of transparencies, and somebody was just flying through, putting these transparencies up, and this clearly shows, this clearly shows, this clearly shows. It doesn't always clearly show that to non-technical experts, and so figuring out how to translate those sort of technical images and make them meaningful. And this is where the issue of scale becomes really important too, because even though these are global issues, the decisions that are made about how to address them are occurring at all scales. And so what's produced sort of from a global standpoint is not particularly meaningful or useful to someone who's, deciding what to do with their particular plot of land at a particular time. So I don't think I think I have more questions than answers on that question. Sorry.
I mean, one of the things that the global environmental change community has promoted recently is, the usage of the planetary boundaries, and it's a heuristic for us to present, sort of the gaining these thresholds of biogeochemical cycles, looking at coral reef decline, decline of Arctic sea ice, and what have you. But to me, it does a couple of things. One, it shows how inadequate our institutions are to deal with these multifaceted global environmental changes. And it also really aims at sort of where the scientists come in, being invited to discuss these things, is almost at a point in time where it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a need to, it seems like there's a need in the governance world to actually have a stronger voice in thinking about policy or institutional structures ahead of time before we enter these areas of collapse. But in your dealings with the Earth system governance, are those being considered, or how are these being considered in a way of dealing with these complexities?
Yeah, well, I would love to come back and talk about planetary boundaries as well, because there's a whole host of critiques of that. But you're absolutely right. And I think that the discussions are taking place around ideas such as anticipatory governance, futuring, right? So developing future scenarios and figuring out a way to develop institutions that are much more flexible and adaptive. Because what we have had historically are governance institutions and governance mechanisms that sort of set, something at a point in time and say, this is, everyone shall do X. This is why the Paris Agreement was actually a pretty major change in terms of how we've been dealing with global environmental problems, and that it has a built-in process of reevaluating every 5 years, of, doing a global stock take, of having countries, update and strengthen their commitments. So that's one example of trying to become more adaptive. But again, this sort of thinking about how do you set up governance institutions to deal with problems that we don't know that we're gonna face. And there's a whole set of the political incentives are not quite there. You can't run for office on I think I can figure out how to deal with the next problem.
Yeah. So let me just intervene also to the participants in the audience, that we do have the question window open. So if you have questions for Michele or a comment, you could use the question box to enter those in, and I'll try to keep track of those. You had some thoughts on the planetary boundaries and its utility.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of critique from the social science world, the development world, of planetary boundaries. And I think this is a great example of where it might not always be clear from the scientific standpoint, but that these things are in fact political and have political implications. So, and I know that the notion of planetary boundaries has been revised over time and updated, but from on the original version of it, the question of who gets to decide what the boundaries are and where the sort of points at which we say that they're overshot, that's a political act. That is an act of power, because certain people, are advantaged or disadvantaged by that. And one of the big critiques that came out of the development community from the planetary boundaries standpoint was that it identified a ceiling but not a floor. And so it said, we have to be able to live in a world where people have sufficient access to resources to meet their basic needs, right? And so, if we talk about trying to avoid those planetary boundaries, we also have to talk about maintaining the system's ability to produce those resources, particularly for the people who are most marginalized. And so this was the donut hole that was identified by Oxfam, for example. And so I think this is another thing of often when we sort of step back and take that sort of global scale scientific look of these planetary geophysical processes that are going on, the people drop out, the human dimension, the sort of social aspect drops out. And I think that's another piece that, again, in terms of thinking about anticipatory governance, understanding, and integrating sort of human lives and livelihoods into those analyses, and being able to tell that part of the story as well is really important.
I've had some, conversations with some of your colleagues at Lund, and when at the Earth System Governance program, and they were, entertaining ways of looking at implementation or meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's, from the policy side, that's been very effective in a sense of at least starting a conversation about these multi-dimensional issues that include climate change and its ramifications and what have you. But I haven't really seen a coherent conversation yet or discussion of trying to weave in aspects of the planetary boundaries into SDGs. And have you seen any of that moving forward?
I mean, I think if anything, it's people have identified the challenge and the mismatch, because I mean, if you followed and I didn't follow them particularly closely, but probably more closely than a lot of other people, the negotiations of the SDGs. And from a planetary boundaries perspective, part of the idea of a planetary boundaries is the interactions between all of these different systems. And yet what the Sustainable Development Goals do is separate out 17 different areas that we're going to focus on. And not all of them are ecological in their focus. And so there's this sort of tension between almost a reductionistic versus an integrative, the sort of reductionist way, again, of making policy and decisions. It's much easier for us to sort of break problems down into these smaller components than to think about problems in their full complexity and all of their interactions. And so I think that there's more than looking for ways to integrate, there's sort of been more of a tension.
Because thinking about the planetary boundaries, there are, in defining those, it seems that the originators kind of had some metrics in mind. And so some measurable observations that could be, repeated, that could be utilized. And it seems in their more concrete metrics than what you see in the SDG side of things, because they're much more socially formed in looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. So it seems like it would be a useful exercise at some point to actually look at the intersections of those two, and actually look at it from both a development or a human-centric view as well as a biophysical view, to really come up with a reconciliation between the two, because there are certain areas where looking at the nitrogen interventions where it's needed. There are other areas where we're overusing nitrogen to where we can pull back, but it's sort of getting more at the scalar issue of looking at more regional or local needs of how they interface and where it makes sense.
Right. So I'm just looking at an article that I was reading a couple of days ago, where I think there's an effort to try to get at some of that in the global change community through Future Earth and development of Earth, the Earth Commission and Earth System targets. And I confess I'm not completely familiar with this. I sort of know that is out there. But I think trying to bring together sort of the social and the biogeochemical or biogeophysical aspects of setting targets that bring those things together in sort of mutually agreed ways, and recognizing the need to divide those across scale is really important. So I know there's been a lot of work looking at the city level, for example. I think there was a meeting just this week where they had people from around the world sort of getting together and saying, how can we set up targets for cities right, that both take into these complexities into consideration, as well as the social and political realities.
I need to take a slightly step back. I overlooked a question that came in about explaining what the planetary boundaries are and what they're meant to be. Several years ago, I think Johan Rockström and others, Will Stefan, promoted or proposed a framework of looking at various boundaries that have at global scale, things related to biodiversity loss, looking at the climate change, looking at levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, looking at the biogeochemical cycles through the use of nitrogen, reactive nitrogen and phosphorus. There are about a dozen of these of levels that they describe at a planetary scale, and that basically using these threshold levels on this pie chart of indicating where we are in managing these various elements and processes across the globe, to where once we cross a particular threshold, then the Earth system is at a critical stage because of overshooting the amount of reactive nitrogen, for instance, in the environment, or the loss or the maintenance of biodiversity, providing ecosystem services. So these are areas of interest that people have the research community have identified that are critical to the planetary metabolism and human well-being. So that's why we're kind of talking about this intersection between sustainable development goals and these type of planetary metrics that operate across the globe. In your work too, you've identified, or through some of the papers that you've touched upon in some of your comments, that as we look at some of the global governance issues, especially with these UN bodies and these large NGOs that operate out there, there seems to be a disconnect between that and sort of national actions, or even further down to what it means in way of local governance, and that there isn't really a good architecture that connects what is being designed in at a global scale, and way of looking at repairing the Earth system, to what it means to livelihoods, to levels of sustainability at local scale that really can be structured meaningfully. There just seems like a strong disconnect between the global and local implementation of, or even the meaning of, what is set as policy at the global scale.
Well, I think part of that observation probably comes from the fact that you're sitting in the US, right? So I think that, here it's a very different conversation in Europe, particularly if you're looking at the link between national and global. In the US, Washington, D.C. has been completely out of step with the global level. I mean, for decades. I mean, they sort of come closer together, but they've never been sort of tightly coupled in the way that they are in many of the European countries, for example. But I think what's interesting, and again, this comes from the work that I've done in the climate arena, if you take sort of Washington out of the picture and look at what is happening in many cities in the US, within many companies in the US, within many states in the US, they actually are operating in ways that are aligning with what's happening at the global level. And so another big shift of Paris was actually recognizing the role of local and non-state actors in the global response. And so there are now mechanisms through the climate treaty regime for cataloging, monitoring, identifying these different actions that are taking place at multiple scales, and recognizing them as part of the process of trying to reach the goals that have been set out in the Paris Agreement. The other thing to remember in the US is that for the last 4 years, there's been a movement we are still in that's been funded by Bloomberg, and Governor Jerry Brown has been active in it. That has basically been mobilizing the US and saying, we, the companies, the cities, the states, the religious leaders, the university leaders, we are going to make sure that we continue to do everything that we can to move forward. And in fact, actually showing up and representing the US at the climate change negotiations in some of the side of, if you go to the US tent, it has been occupied by these actors rather than the federal government. So I think the mismatch isn't quite as big as it appears, perhaps, and again, that's the climate arena. But in terms of individuals making choices, I mean, that's a lot of it is sort of how day to day we make our daily choices, and part of that is the opportunities that people have to make choices. So it's not just that I can decide today that I'm going to stop driving my car, heat my home in a different way. Those are decisions that have to be made at different levels, and that limits my range of choices that I have.
Now that's useful to remind us that, especially in the U.S., that states and local municipalities are really taking strong action, and we'll see what happens in the next administration. But it seems that there's an additional role that the private sector and NGOs then also play at that sort of boundary spanning effort, and it's useful to be able to identify them and I guess work with them.
I think one of the really interesting things that's happened and where you've seen a shift over time, definitely started on the other side of the Atlantic, but is coming here, is really a redefinition. And again, sorry to keep harping on climate change, but some would say it is the issue and everything else is underneath, right? But for a long time, the problem was really defined as an emissions problem, right? We're putting too much of this stuff into the atmosphere. What we've just got to figure out is either how to put less of it in or pull it out and just have to get our emissions down. And I think increasingly it's being recognized as a decarbonization problem. And that's that means you have to think about, well, what are the underlying processes that are causing us to emit greenhouse gas emissions? So it's not just about sort of emitting less, it's about rethinking the ways that we move ourselves around, we produce our goods, issues of production and consumption. And those are fundamentally different ways of thinking about the problem, of thinking about what types of policy and governance mechanisms you need to use, what sorts of incentives. And I think that's where you've seen NGOs really sort of calling attention to some of these underlying deeper questions. But companies are also recognizing that they need to, again, in an anticipatory way, recognize that that's a future we're moving towards, and what are the opportunities, how can they sort of get in on that action, and what are the political or the business opportunities that presents. And I think you're starting to see that language, at least sort of in the public realm of what companies are doing. There's still all kinds of issues about, and they may continue to have other types of investments that counteract that. But I think there's some really interesting things that are happening.
I'm going to jump to another observation and question from the question box. Could you comment on how polycentric governance can help Earth observations and sort of the governance of Earth observations? I don't know if that's an area that you have a feel for.
So let me just define a term. So when we talk about polycentric governance, that's one way. This was Eleanor Ostrom is often associated with her and her husband Betzel, but it gets at this idea that I was saying, where governance is much broader than just governments doing things. And so polycentricity refers to the fact that you may have multiple different sites of authority and activity, and it's multi-level, right? So you can just sort of imagine all these little dots around the globe of people who have different levels of political will, political authority, resources to try to deal with an issue in different ways. And I guess this is the point that I was making in terms of Earth system observations. I think that makes the challenge of figuring out how to manage that sort of science policy relationship that much more complicated, right? Because you have these multiple centers of decision making, which are operating under at different scales, operating with different sort of incentives, different concerns, and so it really, that's where it's really requires almost to translate sort of global scale observations into all of these different contexts. And what was the second part of the question?
It's sort of, in thinking about the Earth observations, is there a way of using a polycentric model to look at its governance? And to me, it sounds like thinking about making it more accessible.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I guess I'll throw that one more to you, but it's in terms of, you know, so I always study sort of the role of science in governance, and governance is sort of a social facing, but there is a whole set of issues about the governance of science. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if that's also about, you know, expanding the range of people who contribute and where observations come from and how that information is produced as well.
I think it highlights a potential tension between the private sector in the remote sensing satellite world and the public sector, in the sense that, at least with NASA products and US products and also ESA and what have you, they're trying to make it more publicly available and free. And so that information then can be useful. And some of the tension lies on at the high resolution remote sensing data, that it's a pay as you go, and access to that then is limited to, you know, those who can pay the price, and then it favors then access to information. And so as we look at transparent governance, you want to have a more open information source. So I think thinking about that sort of, you know, is there a polycentric model for remote sensing data? I think that's an open question. And so, but it's one where I think we are seeing this tension about availability and access of high resolution data and what have you. This is an area that Jim Tucker's been working in. I don't know if you have a comment there, Jim, on
yes, I do, Dennis. Thank you for bringing this up. I think it's imperative that we have Earth observation in the public sphere, because if you have any advantage from Earth observation in the private sphere, it will be used to make money for the companies that control the data, because information can be translated into money regarding stock market swings because of natural disasters or agricultural production, things like this. So I think it's mandatory that there has to be sufficient information in the public sphere so we avoid the possible manipulation of markets or other financial situations using those data for personal and private gain.
Plus, having that transparency, I think, is useful for having multiple communities actually analyzing the data, because oftentimes there's different interpretations that emerge, which is fine. You could have those different interpretations, but you want to actually come back to the same level of observations and facts that you build those interpretations around, and then debate the algorithms or interpretations that are built around them. You know, I go back to some of the arguments over, you know, forest or deforestation in the Amazon, and how controversial that is depending on what sensor one used, and who had access to counting the pixels and things like that. So I think there are things of more openness and transparency which allows a healthier debate.
It's even more important than that. So what's happened recently, there have been many people who are saying, well, the private sector has all these great commercial satellites. We don't need NASA, we don't need NOAA, we don't need ESA, the European Space Agency. And I would argue just the opposite, that we have to have free and open data sources in the public sphere to maintain order and not let people manipulate the system. So I always come back and say, well, would you like to have a private company in charge of all Earth observation? I know damn well they would use it for hedges in the commodity market, and they would make billions of dollars doing so. We need this information in the public sphere, accessible to everyone.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you see as the primary mechanism for doing that? Is it maintaining national observation?
Well, yes. So for example, I think what's happening now between ESA and NASA, that you have the combination of Landsat 8 and hopefully Landsat 9 in a few months with Sentinel 2A and 2B data, where you have 30-meter time series data right now every 3.5 days, and it'll drop to 3 days, every 3 days when Landsat 9, if that is launched and operates successfully. Those data can provide the same information as you could get from planet data at 3 or 4 meter spatial resolution. So I think as long as we have data like that, that will greatly minimize the potential for private companies to laugh all the way to the bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a larger question across issues of governance, that there, again, since the 1990s, there's been this move towards the privatization of public services. And, I agree with you. I think there's very strong arguments for not doing that. And, but that's requires making a strong argument to the public, to decision makers, to continue to, allocate scarce resources to those particular activities. But in principle, I absolutely agree with you.
So at some level, there's a number of global commissions to look at these observations, and at some level they describe sort of the utility of these, but they don't actually work at the accessibility level as much as needed that we're talking about. And at least in this country, I know that NASA is restricted to the 30-meter pixel size, where a lot of the questions or demands for higher resolution spatial data is coming from various user community, and so they rely on the private sector for that information. So there needs to be a change in some of the restrictions that are put on NASA satellite data, and because I think we need to really move that forward. I mean, those policies were set, I believe, in the 1970s or 60s, and very outdated.
So what's happening now, Dennis, is from the Sentinel 2A and 2B imagers, you have 10 and 20 meter data, and NASA is going to the same spatial resolutions, 10 meters for a few bands and 20 meters for many more bands. And I think at 10 meters or 20 meters, you can answer 95% of the problem, or get 95% of the answers for any problem that involves gross primary production, be it of natural systems or agricultural systems. It's not necessary to do this at 3 or 5 meters spatial resolution.
Right. Good point.
So that's sort of the sweet spot, and it can be in the public domain. And the irony is that data from Landsat 8 and Landsat 9 and the Sentinel 2A and 2B imagers are used by the commercial companies to intercalibrate all of their CubeSat instruments. And without this capability, they would be floating in space, not knowing what the calibration was, or meandering in space. So for example, right now, we're using a lot of commercial satellite data in NASA to improve other sources of commercial satellite data, because one system doesn't provide everything. And Landsat data are fundamental to the calibration questions.
So in thinking about how we move forward with maintaining these observations and linking them to policy issues, do you see research moving that direction at NASA of trying to address, these global environmental policy issues, like looking at sustainable development goals, or working toward addressing aspects of the planetary boundaries?
Very much. That within NASA we have an active program on in earth science, on the carbon cycle, on atmospheric composition, on the assimilation of satellite data into numerical simulation models for weather prediction, for climate models, as well as for numerical simulation models of primary production and other biotic processes. So I think things are moving in that direction. It always takes a while for everything to get caught up. Now we have these commercial satellite data, which we can use to disaggregate NASA satellite data and get more information in selected areas at selected times. And one of the problems now is that in NASA, we have access to a huge volume of commercial satellite data, and we're using that to produce surface elevation models, or actually surface elevation retrievals of height, whether it be trees or whatever, at spatial scales of a few meters by a few meters. And so now the commercial companies from whom we purchase the data are saying, well, you can't distribute those. We want to do that for our own gain, which is understandable. So there needs to be some sort of synergy to balance all these issues, and those discussions are underway right now.
This is a world I don't know anything about, so I'm going to ask questions rather than be the presenter. But is there international cooperation in the satellite world, or is this sort of handled on a country by country basis under the guise of security?
Yes and no. For example, ESA, the European Space Agency, finally came around to NASA and NOAA's policy of free and open data, period. It took them
3 years.
They only did this 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, sometime very recently. So I recall in maybe 1995, 2000, I had to buy NASA Landsat data from ESA because they had recorded the data at their receiving station at Abisko in northern Sweden, over Greenland, because Walid Abdullati and I wanted to use those data to look at outlet glacier velocities. And we had to buy the data back from them to do that. This was kind of insult to injury. So I'm glad that ESA finally changed their policy about free and open data, because what you find when you do this is a lot of people start using data, grad students, other people start using it, you make a lot of advances, and people are using the data for things we never dreamed of before.
So a question for you, Michele, that you might address to Jim is, from the policy side, what observations would be helpful in pushing the policy discussion forward on the climate, in the climate arena?
I'm hesitating because I don't think there's not a single answer, right? It's, again, the complication in, if we sort of think about a governance system and polycentricity, there are different actors, different groups operating at different scales, working on different aspects of the problem, right? And so, and again, if you think about the phases of the policy, of the process, the governance process, you know, I guess I can tell you more what I don't think is as useful from a policy perspective are things that say, oh, look, the problem is just as bad as we thought it was going to be, or even worse than it's going to be. Look, you know, it's urgent. We've got to act. Because discussions in the governance realm are more about, they're like, yeah, we get that. Now we've got to figure out how to address it. And so they're dealing at that level. Where, of course, where those types of observations and that type of information is important is in shaping sort of public opinion, because particularly for government decision makers, they are accountable, particularly democratic societies, to their publics. And so the more that the public is calling for changes, that's important. But that's it, again, that's understanding sort of where we are in the decision-making cycle, and how to feed into that process. I know that wasn't a very satisfactory answer. I'll think about that more and get back to you.
No, it sounds like, I mean, it's probably true that we know that there are systems changing. I mean, and we get more images. We see that, the reduction of Arctic ice. We see the scale of fires around the globe. We see images of Greenland ice sheets and Antarctic ice sheets peeling away. So what more do we need? I mean,
right.
The images are compelling enough. It's sort of like finding out maybe places where forests are intact and why, I guess, or where landscapes are functioning in what was this an example of, and maybe find the good stories out there in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, our experience with the coronavirus highlights some of the problems. So I actually have not been a fan of people who say we need to call climate change an emergency, right? Because in fact, when we call something an emergency, we tend to turn over certain powers to government, right? So, around the world, we have said, if we think about coronavirus and this emergency, are we willing to give governments the ability to restrain our individual freedoms? And we know that that's a huge debate. And that's sort of the same thing with dealing with any of these global problems. How do we manage that desire to still have sort of respect for individual freedoms, but while dealing with these global changes? And those are not easy questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're coming up to the top of the hour, and I'm going to look at the question board again and see if there's anything I missed. And I apologize for not getting to them sooner. I don't see anything new on the question board. Do you have any last comments, Michele, that just to summarize our conversation, or Jim, anything that you might want to add as we close this final wonderful webinar series that we've had this past few months?
No, I think a lot of things have been discussed. I really enjoyed hearing what Michele has had to say about governance. That's very important. That's where the rubber hits the road, because we need to adhere to certain actions which don't endanger the pale blue dot.
I think that's a great way to end it.
And then I'll end with a comment that this is a reminder to everyone listening in that on December 11th, a Friday, Compton Tucker will give his actual AGU address for the Sagan lecturer. And he has benefited greatly from our discussions over the last several months, and getting ideas and refining his thoughts for that. So I encourage you all to attend that lecture during AGU, sign up for it. We'll have a Q&A after that lecture, and then also a early to mid-career panel discussion with Jim as well, about thinking about the future of remote sensing and its contributions to Earth system science. Michele, thank you again. This has been wonderful. Always enjoyed talking with you. And Jim, thanks for joining us, and everyone else. It's been enjoyable. So bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dennis. And I'll be giving you a call later to discuss one or two minor things with you.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Michele, it was great hearing your presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for your contributions.
All right.